The Great Miscalculation: How 30 Years of American Investment in China Became an Apprenticeship for Beijing. Introduction. Over the past 3 decades, the United States has invested heavily in China, operating under the belief that such economic engagement would foster liberalization and democratization. However, this strategy has been met with significant miscalculations, leading to unintended consequences that have bolstered Beijing's authoritarian regime rather than weakening it. This report delves into the complexities of American investment in China, highlighting key policy misjudgments, economic ramifications, and the evolving geopolitical landscape. Historical context of U.S. China relations. The U.S. engagement with China began in earnest following President Nixon's 1972 visit, which marked the first step towards normalizing relations between the two countries. The hope was that increased trade and investment would lead to a more open and democratic China. The belief was reinforced by the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, which fueled optimism around the potential for democratic transitions in authoritarian regimes. The pivotal moment occurred in 2001 when China joined the World Trade Organization (WTO). The U.S. expected that this integration into the global economy would necessitate economic reforms and liberalization, ultimately leading to democratic governance. However, the reality has been starkly different. The rise of authoritarianism and economic consequences. Contrary to expectations, China's political landscape has become increasingly authoritarian. The anticipated democratization failed to materialize as the Communist Party consolidated its grip on power. The trade deficit with China, instead of diminishing, skyrocketed from approximately $80 billion to $500 billion annually, raising alarms about job losses in the U.S. and the negative impact on American manufacturing. American companies, drawn by the prospect of cheaper labor and fewer regulations, shifted production to China. This led to a significant increase in the power of Chinese state-owned enterprises (SOEs). Rather than fostering competition, American investment inadvertently contributed to the strengthening of a state-controlled economy which continued to leverage cheap labor and exploit lax regulations. Technological theft and national security risks. As American companies integrated into Chinese supply chains, concerns about technological theft and industrial espionage intensified. Reports of cyber attacks targeting U.S. firms, particularly in sensitive sectors like technology, became more frequent. The lack of intellectual property protections in China exacerbated these risks, prompting fears about national security and the long-term viability of American industries. The 2018 cover story from The Economist bluntly stated that the West had made a grave error in betting on China's future, labeling it as a wrong bet. The realization that China had not become a responsible stakeholder in the global order but was instead pursuing its own authoritarian agenda has shifted the discourse towards decoupling from China. Shifts in global perception and the call for decoupling. The COVID-19 pandemic further highlighted the vulnerabilities of global supply chains heavily reliant on China, prompting discussions about reducing dependence on the country. The realization that over-reliance on a state that does not share democratic values poses significant risks has led to a re-evaluation of economic and diplomatic strategies. Countries like Japan and the United Kingdom have begun to reassess their relationships with China, prioritizing national security over economic gain. The U.S. Congress is now considering legislation to bolster domestic technological leadership, reflecting a growing consensus that a more cautious and informed approach to globalization is necessary. Lessons learned in future strategies. The narrative of U.S.-China relations over the past 3 decades serves as a stark reminder of the complexities inherent in economic policy and political realities. The miscalculations made in the pursuit of engagement with China underscore the need for a more nuanced understanding of globalization's true costs and benefits. Future strategies must prioritize national security, technological advancement, and the welfare of citizens over corporate interests. Policymakers are urged to learn from the past and adopt a more cautious approach to economic engagement with authoritarian regimes. Conclusion. The story of American investment in China is one of unintended consequences, revealing the limitations of optimistic assumptions about economic engagement leading to democratization. As the global landscape continues to evolve, it is imperative that the U.S. re-evaluates its approach to China, taking into account the lessons learned over the past 3 decades. The path forward must prioritize national interest, security, and the promotion of democratic values in an increasingly complex world. The topic, The Great Miscalculation: How 30 Years of American Investment in China Became an Apprenticeship for Beijing, reveals several counterintuitive insights regarding U.S. policy and its impact on China's development over the past 3 decades. 1. Expectations of democratization versus authoritarian consolidation. The initial belief among U.S. policymakers was that increased economic engagement with China would lead to democratization. This expectation was based on historical precedents where economic growth often correlated with political liberalization. However, the counterintuitive outcome has been that as the U.S. invested heavily in China, the Chinese government became more authoritarian. The anticipated transition towards a more open society did not materialize. Instead, China fortified its state control and censorship mechanisms. This stark deviation from the expected trajectory highlights a fundamental misjudgment about the relationship between economic liberalization and political freedom. 2. Trade deficit as a policy failure. U.S. investments in China were predicated on the belief that economic ties would balance trade deficits and create jobs. Instead, the trade deficit ballooned from approximately $80 billion to $500 billion annually, which contradicts the initial assumptions. This outcome not only exacerbated concerns about job losses in the U.S. but also illustrated that the anticipated economic benefits of engagement did not materialize as expected, leading to a re-evaluation of the effectiveness of the policy. 3. Technological collaboration versus theft. U.S. companies anticipated that their investments in China would foster collaboration and technological sharing. However, the reality has been marked by rampant intellectual property theft and cyber-espionage. This unexpected turn of events has raised national security concerns, revealing a significant underestimation of the risks associated with sharing sensitive technologies in a competitive environment where the Chinese government actively supports its enterprises in acquiring foreign technology. 4. The role of state-owned enterprises (SOEs). Rather than diminishing with increased foreign investment, Chinese SOEs have thrived and consolidated power. The U.S. initially viewed China's integration into the global economy as a means to encourage the privatization of state enterprises. Instead, SOEs emerged even stronger, benefiting from foreign investment while simultaneously competing with foreign companies under less stringent regulations. This outcome runs counter to the belief that engagement would promote a more market-oriented economy. 5. Perception of China as a responsible stakeholder. Many in the U.S. believed that engaging China would help integrate it into the existing global order as a responsible stakeholder. However, as China has pursued its own authoritarian agenda and aggressively expanded its influence, the realization that China is not aligning with the democratic norms of the West has prompted discussions about decoupling. This shift reflects a growing acknowledgement that the idealistic view of China's role in the global order was fundamentally flawed. 6. Global supply chain dependencies. The COVID-19 pandemic laid bare the vulnerabilities of global supply chains heavily reliant on China. The initial assumption was that cost efficiencies gained by relying on Chinese manufacturing would outweigh potential risks. However, the pandemic revealed that over-reliance on a single politically unstable source for critical goods could have dire consequences, leading to a reassessment of supply chain strategies across industries. 7. Resistance to decoupling. Despite the growing risks highlighted by the trade practices and authoritarianism of the Chinese regime, many U.S. companies are still hesitant to decouple from China. The investments made over decades and the entrenched supply chain relationships create a significant barrier to exit, contradicting the notion that companies would easily shift their operations elsewhere in response to geopolitical tensions. 8. Misunderstanding of internal dynamics. The assumption that China's economic modernization would naturally lead to a middle-class-driven demand for democratization has not held true. Instead, the economic growth has occurred alongside increasing income inequality and social unrest, with the state maintaining control through various means, including repression and propaganda. This disconnect between economic growth and social change challenges the notion that economic progress automatically leads to political reform. These insights underscore the complexity of the U.S. China relationship and the miscalculations that shaped it. The naive expectations of economic engagement as a means to foster political change have been met with a reality that has often contradicted the foundational beliefs of policymakers. The report, titled The Great Miscalculation: How 30 Years of American Investment in China Became an Apprenticeship for Beijing, delves into the complexities of U.S. investments in China over the past 3 decades, articulating the pitfalls of American policy that have largely misjudged the trajectory of China's development. While many key points are clearly articulated, several significant aspects are often overlooked, which can provide deeper insights into the implications of this miscalculation. Important overlooked content. 1. Historical context of engagement. The report underscores the historical context of U.S. China relations starting from Nixon's opening in 1972. This context is crucial as it shaped the long-standing belief that economic engagement would lead to political liberalization. However, this expectation failed to account for the deeply rooted authoritarian structures within China. The significance lies in understanding that U.S. policymakers operated under a flawed assumption about the transformative power of capitalism and authoritarian regimes, which has implications for how future engagements with other authoritarian states might be framed. 2. The trade deficit. The ballooning trade deficit with China, which escalated from approximately $80 billion to $500 billion annually, is a stark indicator of the failure of U.S. policy. Many discussions focus on job losses in the U.S. and the economic implications of this deficit. Yet the broader repercussions, such as the strengthening of the Chinese state-owned enterprises (SOEs) and their impact on global supply chains, are often understated. This is significant because it highlights how U.S. investments inadvertently empowered entities that operate against U.S. interests, making future trade negotiations more complex. 3. Technological theft and national security risks. The increase in cyber theft and industrial espionage targeting American firms is a critical point that many discussions tend to gloss over. The security risks associated with technological transfers to China have profound implications for national security, especially as American companies become enmeshed in Chinese supply chains. This aspect is significant as it raises questions about the long-term viability of U.S. technological leadership and the ethical considerations of engaging in partnerships with entities that may exploit such arrangements. 4. The role of state-owned enterprises. The report notes that rather than diminishing, SOEs in China have consolidated their power and influence, which contradicts the expectation that economic liberalization would weaken state control. This insight is crucial as it emphasizes the resilience of state capitalism in China, challenging the narrative that market forces alone can induce democratic reforms. Understanding this dynamic is vital for forecasting the future of China's economic and political landscape and the potential responses from the U.S. and its allies. 5. The shift in global perception. The realization that China has not become a responsible stakeholder but is instead pursuing an authoritarian agenda is significant. This shift in perception among global leaders and policymakers has implications for international relations, trade policies, and security alliances. As countries begin to reassess their dependencies on China, discussions about decoupling become increasingly relevant. But the complexities of such a transition are often underestimated. 6. Decoupling from China. The report discusses the emerging discourse around decoupling from China as a response to the risks associated with over-reliance on an authoritarian regime. However, the challenges inherent in this process, such as the logistical, economic, and political ramifications of shifting supply chains are frequently downplayed. The significance of this discussion lies in the recognition that decoupling is not merely a strategic choice but a complex undertaking that could have wide-ranging repercussions for global trade and economic stability. 7. Lessons learned in future strategies. The report suggests that the lessons learned from decades of engagement with China must inform future U.S. economic and diplomatic strategies. This is significant because it challenges the prevailing notion that engagement alone is the path to reform and highlights the necessity for a more nuanced approach that considers the political realities of authoritarian regimes. Policymakers must grapple with the implications of these lessons for future engagements with other nations that may exhibit similar authoritarian tendencies. Conclusion. The report, The Great Miscalculation, serves as a critical analysis of the U.S. investment strategy in China and its unintended consequences. While many of the obvious pitfalls are discussed, the overlooked aspects, such as the historical context, trade deficits, technological theft, SOE dynamics, global perceptions, the complexities of decoupling, and lessons for future strategy, are essential for a comprehensive understanding of the U.S. China relationship. Recognizing these factors is significant not only for assessing past policies but also for shaping a more informed and strategic approach to international relations and economic engagements moving forward. 1. Misguided optimism and policy miscalculations. The belief that economic engagement would lead to democratization in China has proven to be a significant miscalculation. U.S. policy since Nixon's opening to China has been predicated on the assumption that integrating China into the global economy would encourage liberalization. Instead, this engagement has fostered increased authoritarianism. With China expanding its global influence while the U.S. trade deficit ballooned from $80 billion to $500 billion. The persistence of this optimistic viewpoint across multiple administrations indicates a profound misunderstanding of China's political and economic trajectory, which has not aligned with the expectations of Western policymakers. 2. Trade deficit and economic consequences. The trade deficit with China serves as a stark indicator of the failure of U.S. economic policy. The expected reduction of this deficit following China's accession to the World Trade Organization (WTO) did not materialize, instead it grew, leading to significant job losses in the U.S. This situation has prompted discussions about the need for decoupling from China to protect American jobs and industries. The trade deficit is not merely an economic statistic but a reflection of the broader implications of U.S.-China relations and the consequences of reliance on Chinese manufacturing. 3. Technological theft and national security risks. The integration of American companies into Chinese supply chains has heightened concerns about technological theft and national security. Reports of cyber theft and espionage targeting sensitive technologies have escalated, revealing vulnerabilities in U.S. companies operating within China. This aspect of U.S.-China relations underscores the risks associated with economic interdependence with a state that engages in aggressive industrial policies and espionage, challenging the notion that economic engagement leads to mutual benefits. 4. Shift in global perception and future strategies. There is a growing recognition that China has not evolved into a responsible stakeholder in the global order as initially anticipated. Instead, it has pursued its own authoritarian agenda, prompting a re-evaluation of engagement strategies. The COVID-19 pandemic has further exposed vulnerabilities in global supply chains, leading to a consensus among many nations regarding the need to reduce dependence on China. This shift in perception has catalyzed discussions about new economic policies that prioritize domestic industries and technological leadership, as well as a more cautious approach to globalization that considers the political realities of engaging with authoritarian regimes. Here are 3 famous historical cases that share similarities with the theme of the Great Miscalculation: how 30 years of American investment in China became an apprenticeship for Beijing. 1. The Opium Wars and British imperialism in China 1839 to 1860. The Opium Wars were a series of conflicts between China and Western powers, primarily Britain, over trade imbalances and the opium trade. Britain, seeking to address its trade deficit with China, began exporting opium from India to China, leading to widespread addiction and social issues. The Chinese government attempted to suppress the opium trade, leading to military confrontations. The resulting Treaty of Nanking, Treaty of Tientsin, forced China to open its ports to British trade, ceding territory, notably Hong Kong, and granting extraterritorial rights to British citizens. This period highlighted the dangers of foreign intervention and economic exploitation, leading to significant national upheaval and the eventual decline of the Qing dynasty. 2. U.S. investment in Latin America during the 20th century. Throughout the 20th century, the United States invested heavily in Latin America, particularly in infrastructure and resource extraction. This investment was predicated on the belief that economic development would lead to political stability and democracy. However, in many cases it led to the strengthening of authoritarian regimes that were friendly to U.S. interests, fostering dependency rather than self-sufficiency. The U.S. supported coups such as in Chile in 1973 to protect its investments, resulting in long-term political and social consequences. The unintended consequence was a legacy of instability, resentment, and economic inequality, paralleling the concerns about American investment in China, leading to the strengthening of an authoritarian state. 3. The Marshall Plan and its impact on Europe, 1948 to 1952. The Marshall Plan was an American initiative to aid Western Europe post-World War II, providing over $12 billion, around $100 billion today, in economic assistance to help rebuild economies and prevent the spread of Soviet communism. Initially, the plan was seen as a success, reviving European economies and fostering cooperation. However, the underlying assumption that economic prosperity would guarantee political stability and democratic governance proved overly optimistic. In some cases, countries that received Marshall Plan aid still experienced political turmoil and the rise of extremist movements, demonstrating the complex interplay between economic aid and political outcomes. This reflects the miscalculations regarding the belief that economic integration would automatically lead to democratic reforms, similar to the expectations placed on U.S. China relations. These historical instances illustrate the complexities and unintended consequences of foreign investment and economic engagement, echoing the themes raised in the discussion of American investment in China. The future outlook regarding U.S. investments in China, as highlighted in The Great Miscalculation, How 30 Years of American Investment in China Became an Apprenticeship for Beijing, is marked by a complex interplay of geopolitical dynamics, economic strategies, and evolving social landscapes. Here are some key predictions for the future. 1. Decoupling and supply chain resilience. The trend of decoupling from China is likely to continue as U.S. companies reassess their reliance on Chinese manufacturing. This shift may accelerate due to heightened geopolitical tensions and lessons learned from the COVID-19 pandemic, which exposed vulnerabilities in global supply chains. Companies will increasingly diversify their supply chains to include countries like Vietnam, India, and Mexico, aiming to reduce risks associated with overdependence on a single nation. 2. Increased national security measures. As concerns about national security and intellectual property theft persist, U.S. policymakers are expected to implement stricter regulations on technology transfers and investments in China. Export controls on advanced technologies, particularly in areas such as semiconductors, artificial intelligence, and biotechnology, may become more stringent. This will impact collaboration between American firms and their Chinese counterparts, leading to a more insular tech ecosystem in the U.S. 3. Re-evaluation of trade agreements. Future U.S. administrations are likely to revisit trade agreements with China, potentially seeking to renegotiate terms that better protect American interests. The focus may shift from purely economic engagement to a more strategic approach that aligns trade policies with national security objectives. This could lead to tariffs, quotas, or other trade barriers aimed at protecting key industries. 4. Impact on global economic alliances. The U.S. China relationship will continue to shape global economic alliances. Countries in Asia and beyond may find themselves navigating between the two superpowers seeking to optimize their economic engagements while mitigating risks. This could lead to the formation of new trade blocs or partnerships that exclude China as nations look for stability in their economic relationships. 5. China's technological autarky. China's push for technological self-sufficiency is likely to gain momentum. The Chinese government will continue to invest heavily in research and development to mitigate external pressures and enhance domestic industries. This may result in advancements in key sectors such as green technology, artificial intelligence, and advanced manufacturing, enabling China to position itself as a global leader in these areas independent of U.S. influence. 6. Social and political stability challenges. Internally, China may face challenges related to social stability as economic growth slows. As the Chinese middle class expands, there may be increasing demands for political reforms and greater freedoms. The government's response to these pressures will be critical. A heavy-handed approach could lead to unrest, while a more conciliatory stance might foster a more engaged civil society. 7. Environmental and economic sustainability. Both the U.S. and China will be compelled to address environmental sustainability as climate change intensifies. Collaborative efforts on clean energy technologies may be a rare area of cooperation amidst broader tensions. However, national interests will often overshadow collective action, leading to competitive dynamics in green technology innovation. 8. Investment in workforce development. The U.S. may focus on enhancing its workforce's skills to compete with China. Investments in education, vocational training, and STEM science, technology, engineering, and mathematics initiatives will be prioritized to ensure that American workers are equipped to thrive in a technology-driven economy. 9. Cultural and ideological divergence. The ideological divide between democratic values and authoritarian governance is likely to deepen. The U.S. will continue to champion democracy and human rights, which may further strain diplomatic relations with China. This ideological battle will be reflected in global forums and could lead to a bifurcation of international norms and standards. 10. Potential for conflict. While outright military conflict remains unlikely, tensions in regions such as the South China Sea or Taiwan could escalate. Both nations will need to navigate these flashpoints carefully to avoid miscalculations that could lead to broader confrontations. Conclusion. The future of U.S.-China relations, shaped by 3 decades of investment and engagement, will hinge on the ability of both nations to adapt to changing global dynamics. The lessons learned from the past will guide future strategies, emphasizing the need for a balanced approach that prioritizes national interests while fostering a stable global economic landscape.